Okay, welcome back to another episode of Wise Words Book Summaries. Today we are doing Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott. James C. Scott is a scholar who studies how people interact with power structures. His work, such as Seeing Like a State, explores the problems of large-scale, top-down planning by governments. He's also known for discussing how ordinary people resist control in their everyday lives and works, like weapons of the weak. Overall, he's contributed significantly to the understanding of power dynamics and social change. And as usual, we sort of start with how to find this book.
Yeah, let's do it. Why not?
Cool. The introduction. So the purpose of this book. James Scott initially set out to understand why states often find themselves at odds with nomadic groups. This conflict, however, is not confined to any particular region. Throughout history, states have consistently encountered challenges with various mobile groups like nomads, hunter-gatherers, gypsies, vagrants, homeless people, and serfs. The state's efforts to settle these groups, known as sedentarization, has been a common yet largely unsuccessful objective. In examining these sedentarization attempts, Scott uncovered that they were part of the state's broader strategy to organize society in a manner conducive to its primary functions. These functions include effective taxation, military conscription, and quelling rebellions. He began to recognize that legibility is the key component to state governance. Historically, states grapple with limited knowledge about the citizens' wealth, property, location, and even identities. They lacked a comprehensive map of their territories, and people did not possess a standardized system for measuring and recording information. Consequently, their interventions were often ill-informed and ineffective. So efforts such as the establishment of permanent last names, standardization of weights and measures, creation of population registers, land surveys, and the introduction of freehold property, uniform language and legal practices, city planning, and transportation organization were all directed towards making society more legible and manageable for the state. These initiatives involve transforming complex, locally rooted practices like land ownership, customs, or naming systems into standardized formats that can be centrally recorded and monitored. This book also probes the reasons behind the failure for utopian social schemes. Scott concludes that these schemes often fail because their architects greatly overestimated their own understanding and underestimated the wisdom of the population they aim to serve or reform.
Yeah.
That's a good brief overview of the book, isn't it?
It is very good. No, it is really interesting, and you can start to see how it just lays out a structure of how the book goes, and it goes about talking about how how societies grow, and they grow beyond a certain size, and so then it's unfeasible to cooperate anymore, and so you need some kind of form of organization. That organization leads some kind of standardized metric that you use, and then that metric, as we'll talk about later on, becomes like Goddard's law. The measure that you use to measure something ends up becoming the actual outcome that you're striving for, and so you kind of assimilate reality, or in this case society, to the actual measure that you put in place. All right, well then, on to the next part. So how societal transformations go wrong. It's not difficult to understand how conflicts among different ethnic groups, religious sects, or language communities have led to tragic losses through organized violence. Yet it's a more complex task to grasp why many well-intentioned efforts to improve humanity have ended in disaster. James Scott seeks to provide a thorough explanation for why some significant utopian social engineering projects of the 20th century failed. Scott pinpoints 4 factors that lead to catastrophic outcomes in state-led societal changes. The first factor is the state's simplification and organization of society and nature. These efforts, while fundamental to modern governance, can serve to enhance citizen welfare and liberty, but can also bolster oppressive regimes. Such changes lay the groundwork for defining citizenship and providing social benefits, but they also have the potential for more sinister uses, such as the roundup of marginalized groups, as we've seen in the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
The second factor Scott identifies is high modernist ideology. This is characterized by a robust belief in scientific and technological progress, increased production, and the creation of a socially rational order based on scientific principles. Originating in the West, this ideology borrowed the legitimacy of science and technology, but lacked critical skepticism about its ability to comprehensively plan human society and production. When this ideology merges with the administrative ordering of society, it forms a potentially hazardous mix. And this I kind of like draw parallels with, and I'm with Anti-Fragile, because it's that like kind of human hubris to assume that they can just like, you know, interfere with the system and there be no repercussions, you know, because they know the science, but the science is kind of, you know, their understanding of it is actually just limited. The third component, as outlined by Scott, is the existence of an authoritarian state capable of enforcing high modernist ideologies through coercion. Historically, conditions such as war, revolution, economic crises, and national liberation movements have been conducive to the rise of authoritarian regimes. These periods often lead to the adoption of emergency powers, the overthrow of existing governance structures, and the emergence of leaders with radical plans for societal overhaul. Lastly, the fourth factor is a weakened civil society incapable of resisting these authoritarian plans. Social upheavals, revolutions, and economic challenges can significantly debilitate civil society, rendering it more susceptible to change. This vulnerability in the social fabric allows for the easier implementation of state-led agendas, often to the detriment of the populace.
I think it's quite interesting because a lot of these points kind of, like the main underpinning for me at least, is the fact that human hubris comes into it, sort of the belief that we can manipulate, I guess, nature to some extent, but also human societies. It's almost like we treat it like an engineering problem where, you know, all the cogs fit in a certain way and you can figure out how to move the cogs and achieve an objective, right? Yeah. And it's just, it always has been and always will be hubris to some degree, as we'll find out later, because the methodologies we use to analyze and manage society are just abstractions and they don't actually represent the things that you think they do. And also they could be gamed, like you said, with Goodhart's law, right? Like, when you have a measure, it ceases to become a good measure because people figure out how to game systems, how to game measurements, right? It's silly. So,
no, exactly. We come from like a place of ignorance and maybe like with good intentions, you know, we want to figure something out, but in the process of trying to figure something out or organize it or structure it or control it, you know, we then become that, like, ignorance becomes arrogance, you know, and especially like this ties in a lot with what we've been talking about with psychology of totalitarianism and like corruption, corruptible, this, you know, this arrogance about assuming that we know what we're doing because we can understand science, we can just apply science to everything, but actually we lack a lot of information. And as he has like prime examples here that we'll get onto.
Yeah, no, 100% right. Before others will repeat ourselves because it's the pitfalls of order. So James Scott also goes on to highlight the vital role of hands-on experience, informal procedures, and adaptability in managing uncertainty. He critiques plans, social structures for their tendency to oversimplify complex realities. Scott argues that focusing narrowly on a subject allows for deeper insight into a specific facet of a broader context. This approach simplifies a subject, enhancing its legibility, and facilitating more precise measurement and analysis. When combined with similar methods, it leads to a thorough, albeit selective, understanding of reality, enabling better control and manipulation. However, Scott notes that formal structures heavily rely on informal processes. They often don't acknowledge, but are essential for their survival and effectiveness. These informal methods, unrecognized by formal systems, are indispensable for their creation and continued operation. As we will see later.
Yeah, so to get into it then. Part 1, State Projects of Legibility and Simplification. Running a state, the forestry analogy. And this is kind of what I was touching on just before. Yeah. So the concept of fiscal forestry in state systems transformed the multifunctional living tree into a mere abstract unit of lumber or firewood volume. This approach led to the idea of restoration forestry, which aimed to recreate forest ecologies in a controlled manner, yet often overlooked the crucial element of diversity inherent in natural forests, already hinting at the aspect of things that we don't know and, you know, making assumptions about things with a lack of knowledge. This shift to production production forestry underlines the perils of simplifying complex and poorly understood ecological relationships to focus on a single utilitarian value. Driven by the goal of commodity production, this process eliminated aspects of the forest that hindered efficient production and disregarded elements unrelated to this goal. The resulting simplified forest was easier to manage and experiment with, as it reduced variability. This simplification allowed for the application of novel forest management techniques in near experimental conditions. Linear arrangements of same-age trees and the removal of underbrush streamlined processes like clearing, felling, extraction, and replanting. Even inexperienced workers could follow standardized protocols in these uniform forests. The standardization of log sizes simplified yield forecasts and facilitated the marketing of homogeneous timber to contractors and merchants. While this approach maximized returns from timber, it was apt for centralized management but disregarded the forest's wider ecological and social roles. From an anthropological perspective, the state's focus on timber production neglected the diverse, socially negotiated uses of the forest, such as hunting, gathering, pasturage, and cultural practices like worship or refuge. While the state's approach to forestry and taxation shared similarities in simplification for administrative ease, the analogy breaks down considering the political agency of taxpayers. Unlike trees, people subjected to taxation can resist, flee, or revolt, making it crucial for the state to understand not just the economic conditions of its subjects, but also the level of tax burden they would tolerate. Without accurate data on sustainable timber yields, the state faced the risk of overexploiting its forests or failing to maximize potential revenue.
Yeah, I love this analogy, to be honest.
Yeah, it's really good.
It's super interesting because I think we talked about it before, but like when you take a complex reality and then turn it into one specific measurement, a bit like here, like yield production or whatever, or lumber yield, you like he says here, you forget all the other potential uses of a forest, right? It's not just about cutting it up and using it for lumber or whatever, you know. Yeah. And we were saying before, like it's kind of like money. When you just abstract everything down to money and production, like we do with economics, you forget there's so many other valuable things in life to do and things we could be aiming for that isn't just, you know, national product or gross national product, whatever it's called, or GDP, gross domestic product. You know, it's like there is other things, but we seem to be so fixated on these specific values or specific things that we try and over optimize, right? And we don't have multiple optimization metrics. We tend to end up finding one and then changing everything to just try and optimize that one thing. And you can see it playing out across not just a forest, right? It plays out even in businesses to some degree. Like, you see like, this person here, he's got one use for this one thing. But the reality is this person might even also offer other things to the company. Like they might be friends with everybody else. Everyone feels great around them, but you just put them down to like, they're just a cost, you know? You simplify everything. They're just a number.
No, absolutely. And I wonder whether that also stages what people can go, like, for instance, if your approach to forestry starts off as production, timber production, then I wonder if that sets this kind of foundation where everything has to be timber oriented. Do you know what? Okay. Do you know what I mean? Like after that, because it kind of sets almost a perspective of how we would see forests after that. It creates this kind of utilitarian like association to that thing. Now we see a tree as money. We see it as like, you know, a product. And it's almost like a paradigm shift to have to break out of that because it's already set the scene, you know?
Yeah. It's like, how else could this be? Could this be something else but not just yield or money? Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Exactly, because people will now just see it as like, they'll have one kind of thought about it, but... And then you get the odd person who comes through and be like, actually, we can use forest for this, and this, you know? But I feel like a lot of people get stuck in the same way of thinking because this kind of paradigm has been set.
Yes, exactly. As we'll get on to this next point. So the utilitarian language that underpins our modern times. So words often reflect the user's priority and interests. The language used to categorize nature often reflects the priorities of those using it. Instead of using the terms nature, utilitarian language often refers to natural resources, highlighting the aspects of nature that can be utilized for human purposes. Similar logic is applied to plants and animals where valuable species are given positive labels such as crops, timber, game, or livestock, while those that compete or harm them are designated as weeds, pests, predators, or varmints. And yeah, like you just said there, it's the same. It's this idea of a resource. It's a resource. Therefore, it needs to be used in some aspect. It can't just be enjoyed for what it is, almost, you know? It comes literally in the terminology itself, that sort of use, if that makes sense. Like, you can't get out that paradigm where the language itself describes it in such a way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you know, another point, like this simplification, you know, like as soon as you create a goal for something, you have to streamline a process to get there, right? And to do that, you have to simplify all the complexity. And so, as you know, he mentioned in that analogy before, and I think one of the things that I really like, I really identify with is when he was saying, you know, people who aren't trained can do it, you know, or people who are uneducated can do it. And I think that kind of says a lot, especially about our society, where we want to make things as simple as possible. It doesn't matter about whether they're actually doing a good job or not, or whether there's like a much bigger purpose to whatever, you know, they're dealing with. But yeah, how can we make it so procedural? How can we get someone who doesn't, you know, it doesn't cost money to train them or to educate them, and they can just do it? There's this thing at the moment in the UK where instead of paying doctors more, right, they've created this new kind of doctor. It's like a doctor's assistant, okay? And basically it's like a streamlined scheme for people to get to this point where they're like this doctor's associate, but then they can't surpass a certain level. So they get paid more than like junior doctors, but then they just can't excel anymore. And so it's just like, how can we get people to do all this kind of procedural stuff as quickly as possible, rather than actually dealing with the problem, which is, you know, well, doctors don't get paid enough, or, you know, there's clearly an issue with this, you know, the medical system here. But that just goes to show you, right? We kind of really want to simplify things down rather than actually deal with the actual issue at hand.
Yeah, I do. I wonder also whether it's kind of like a bit like in the psychology of the psychology of totalitarianism, when he talks about this like mechanistic ideology. It kind of is mechanistic in that sense. It's like,
absolutely,
let's simplify tasks and things into things that like are steps. Once again, you're like a cog in a machine, and we create this like a mechanistic way of living. Which as you can imagine, I don't think is one of the is a way of living that gives people happiness and fulfillment, right? Like, you know, you're just pencil pushing or whatever you want to call it, just doing admin. You're just following procedure, right?
Yeah.
No, I don't. Maybe there are some people who enjoy that, and I'm sure there is. To some people, just removing the complexity of life. Just, I don't mind going to work, just doing this, and that, following, you know, what's been laid out in front of me. But I don't think it's potentially like soul nurturing. Let's just call it that way.
It's interesting. It also starts to kind of tie in with a bit of Jordan Peterson, that, you know, when he talks about like utilitarianism and like what you value. If you have something that you value, then you have to almost approach it not in a mechanistic way, but you have to have some kind of procedure to get that, to obtain that value, right? And to do that, you have to simplify the complexity of reality, because there are so many different goals that you could obtain out of a forest, for example, right? But you've got one that you've set your eyes on. And I think that's the issue here, is that, like, you know, we need to be careful about what goal we pick, what we choose to value, because as soon as we do that, we disrupt a whole system, or we neglect loads of other values that it has. I
was going to say, just on that point, it's kind of like a trade-off. When you set that goal, you're obviously going to optimize around it and achieve that goal to some respect, but at what cost, kind of thing. And this is kind of where I guess we're at, right, in terms of the general society and economic system. Kind of, you know, we've managed to increase our standards of living as the common, you know, let's just say marketing, but the common narrative, isn't it? Is like, oh, economic progress means standard of living averagely has increased and everybody lives a better life. But the reality is, we're just assuming that's the best way. Like, the standard of living and the best products is the best way to live a human life, right? There's other goals, there's other objectives we could be going after, which don't revolve around optimizing money, for example, right? It sounds quite hippie to say stuff like that, but if in my case, all these sort of like anti-popular narratives are all about this. They're just like, we've chosen a different goal and we're going to try and solve this goal as a collective, you know, or we're going to try and do this and that.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's like, you know, when you're approaching a system, you almost need to approach it in a way like, what are all the possible values that it could offer, right? What are all the things that we could derive from it, so that we know all the different angles that we could approach this thing. And I think that's impossible to know, right? Because you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
But So I almost think that this approach is inevitable. But I think being aware that it can be like a trial and error and that we can fix it. And once we come across new values, if we go into a forest and we're like, oh, the only thing here is, we can turn wood into timber and then we can sell it. And then along that process, we realize, oh, actually, if we remove these trees, then it affects the soil and it affects the agriculture and all this kind of stuff. Then you have to update that system, right? To take account of that new value that you found. How can we harness that value as well? And then you keep going rather than just sticking with one and obliterating and neglecting all the rest.
Kind of like no matter the cost kind of thinking.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah. We're going to follow this goal no matter what, this negative stuff has happened. There's just another problem to be solved. Okay, now there's no more trees left. Okay, we'll replant them and reharvest them in the future kind of thing. It's,
Exactly. Yeah, interesting. Where are we now? I can't even...
So we're on the schematics of social order. I'll just do this one.
Yeah.
So schematics of social order, simplifying complexity. James Scott argues that governments inherently simplify the complexity of real-life communities. The intricacies of any community are too vast for complete bureaucratic capture. Governments, like foresters, don't document entire social or ecological realities. Instead, they abstract and simplify based on objectives like taxation, control, and conscription, especially before the 19th century, using basic techniques for these limited goals. They also standardise local practices. So Scott notes a recurring theme: the interaction between local knowledge and state administrative processes. States often found local practices like land measurement and ownership too complex for their administrative frameworks, leading to their simplification or modification into a manageable form. Then we have uniformity in measurement systems. So locally evolved measurement systems, through diverse presented challenges to state-imposed uniformity. Many early measurements were based on human scales and varied by location and person. For instance, distances could be measured in stone's throws or volumes in cartloads, which differed widely. Measurements were also contextual. For example, the distance to a village might be given in times like 3 rice cookings, reflecting travel time rather than physical distance. These local measurements, deeply tied to regional activities and specificities, resisted standardization due to their inherently local nature and relevance. And I like this point about this 3 rice cookings because it's focusing on the time spent and the feeling, or the subjective feeling of the time spent rather than the physical distance. Because it's a good point. Like when I think, there's a 2 kilometers, I actually don't care there's 2 kilometers. I care how long is it going to take me to walk 2 kilometers or drive 2 kilometers, right? And that's what most people. And I feel like some of our measurements and systems we use don't mold nicely with what we need. Like, for example, with Apple Maps, right, I've got to walk somewhere, it's 3 kilometers away. That actually doesn't mean anything to me. I have a rough idea of my speed, right? Which is why I guess it's quite useful for them to be like, okay, it's a 20-minute walk, or it's a 5-minute car journey, or whatever. It's so interesting because that for me is the thing that actually matters the most, and I'm sure it's for most people, because it's not about the actual distance, it's about how long is it and how long is it going to feel. And right, with a point of reference of that, if you don't have a standardized measurement, which, well, I guess you do have technically time now, but 3 rice cookings, if you cook a lot of rice, you know how long that's going to take, right? Roughly. So it's just interesting that would be some of the ways people used to measure things.
Yeah, it really is. And it's like, I love that idea of like the contextualization of it, because people understand. And it's also like a mark of like whether people understand you or whether they come from like a similar background, right? It's like they understand the three cups of rice, or three bowls of rice, because it's rooted in function, it's rooted in purpose. It's not abstract, it's not detached, so it's kind of got more meaning, right? You understand it much better. Whereas like it's like the distance is such a funny thing. I think there is a point at which it gets to something that we can understand, but then anything beyond that, it's just too abstract for us. I can understand what like a kilometer is, but I can only understand that because I've adapted to it, right? Like I've used it in like rowing and stuff like that. So I can visually perceive what a kilometer is. But if I was to be
but you visually perceive it through but you visually perceive it through like a reference of something you've done, like rowing, like you just said. You kind of almost visually represent it in something that's other than just a number.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. It's like, and so there's, I guess the scale changes, right? Like it could be contextualized literally just to you, right? Like my example of rowing is very unique to me, but it wouldn't be to most people. So it's quite difficult to like, share a common measure. But then sometimes it can get too abstract where no one can share it, you know? Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so on to the next part. So the value in local measurements and why they aren't of use to states. The local measurement practices are typically imprecise, tailored to the demands of specific tasks. For instance, rainfall's impact on crop is more crucial than its exact amount in inches. Similarly, the variability in rice yield is better understood through a range than a precise average. These traditional measures are deeply context-specific, relevant to particular situations, times, and locations. Modern abstract measurements like hectares or acres often don't resonate with the practical realities of those working the land. For example, informing a farmer about acreage without considering factors like labor or technology is inadequate. So there's a quote here. Telling a farmer only that he is leasing 20 acres of land is about as helpful as telling a scholar that he has bought 6 kilograms of books. It's a very good point, right? Like, it's just a completely different world.
Yeah.
Customary measures reflect practical significance, such as the days required for ploughing in labor-scarce regions. These metrics evolved with regional conditions like crop cycles and weather patterns. If the state were to directly incorporate these local measurements, the resulting data would be too complex and varied for straightforward aggregation and comparison by state officials. This highlights that measurement is not just about objective accuracy, it's shaped by power, dynamic, and the interest of various social groups, from aristocrats to serfs. Understanding these early measurement practices requires considering the influence of power and social structures. It's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. I love this idea of sort of the books. Like you can't just it doesn't tell you anything if you've got 6
it really
kilograms
doesn't.
of books. It's kind of the same thing with the I got like 10 acres. It's like, okay, cool, but what's the land shape? What's the soil like? Especially for a farmer, right? I'm not speaking for the average person maybe, but it's like it's not really informative, right? It finally gives you the scale or the size of an area, right? For example, the same with the 6 kilograms of books. Oh, well, there's like a lot of knowledge in there, but it doesn't tell you what knowledge is in there. It's like the most important factor in sort of making a decision whether you're going to read a book or something. It's kind of the same with this. It's like, okay, great, you got like 10 acres, but it's just it's rocks and mountains. That's of no use. So
no, it's so true, and it kind of like hints at this idea that measures naturally emerge as a result of like a function of like
of problem solving and use, I guess, to some degree.
Yeah, because if you think about it, like it's a result of a function. It's a result of you doing something, and then it's like, oh, okay, we can measure it in that. We can measure it in the experience that we have gained, right? And so it's a reflection of the purpose that you do. In this case, 6 kilograms of books doesn't mean anything to a scholar, but it could mean something to a scientist who's trying to measure the weight of how many books or something like that, right? So it completely differs based on
knowledge density of books.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why he'd be doing that, but yeah, I like the idea that, measures emerge naturally, but if you try to implement a measure or a metric, then it straight away kind of distorts it because now you're aiming for that metric,
So this reminds me a lot of Rory Sutherland. I love his stuff, and one of the things he talks about with like this over-metric obsession sort of thing is, we sort of measure house pricing based on the square footage or whatever. And he's like, it doesn't take into account anything else which could be of value. And he's like, you can actually get bargain properties because they're just measured in value through square footage rather than architectural, the aesthetics of the building.
Yeah.
So you can get some amazing bargains with a house maybe doesn't have the best square footage, but it looks gorgeous. It's like, and they don't actually place an economic premium on it. It's crazy because obviously that stuff can't be turned into a metric.
Yeah.
Like we spoke about this before with like research projects and stuff, taking something subjective and trying to turn it into a numerical metric is just impossible because everybody has a different subjective number rating of certain things, right? I just thought it's so interesting because it just reminds me of that. It's like square foot to some degree obviously gives you a rough idea, obviously, of the size, but it doesn't give you any idea of the actual makeup of an apartment. Let's just say you're looking at the square footage of an apartment. Oh wow, but the toilet's in the hallway. Like you
Yeah,
walk into
yeah,
the toilet
yeah, yeah.
first. That's just like, first of all, obviously that wouldn't happen. It's stupid, but it doesn't give you that information, which is actually like matters for people.
Yeah,
You know, oh, it's got great square footage, but the bedroom, you have to walk through the bedroom to get to the living room.
yeah.
That's just not practical. I know obviously the houses aren't built like this, but the point remains the same. There's more information that's needed other
Yeah.
than square footage.
No,
Yet we sort
absolutely.
of like fetishize it. And we put prices based upon this stuff.
And I
I
think-
guess it's because the easiest way, man. I think it's just because it's so hard to quantify things that are abstract. So they just quantify basically on the things that are easy to measure, which is it's easy to measure the size. Therefore, we're just going to price it on size because I can't be bothered to have to figure out all the little intricacies. Like, oh wow, there's like an extra. The bedroom's a little bit bigger than the kitchen. That's of value. Or the kitchen's a little bit bigger than the dining room. That might be of value. Therefore, we can put a premium on it. But they don't. It's just like let's average it out. Let's keep it easy.
Yeah.
Here's the square footing. Here's the price.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think as a result, it kind of creates a market that tells people what to value, which is size, rather than like, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
these are our most expensive ones, they're our biggest houses, but it says nothing, like you said, about the aesthetic or, whether someone actually like it. Yeah, and you can start to see how when there is a metric put in place and then the markets then dictate it, that some people benefit more than others, right? The people who can control that kind of metric are in place to benefit more than others. Yeah, interesting.
I think this is where it's quite interesting as well. I feel like if you can redefine your priorities of what you're looking for and have your own sort of like checklist, which is maybe not like turnable into a metric, you can probably find some bargains for what you're looking for. Because if everybody's pricing based on these things and you're like, right, well, actually, I personally really value a really big kitchen because I like to cook or something like that. You can then start making astute, good decisions based off that. But I think it comes down to you got to be clear on your criteria and you don't listen to the criteria of others. You obviously use that as the standard pricing guide, which everybody tends to do.
Yeah.
You can probably find yourself some bargains where you're like, do you know what? We could have bought this flat for the same price. But if you look at the actual makeup, it just does not fit the use case we want it for.
Yeah.
Like, obviously people do that, but I just think it's interesting when you define the stuff you care about first and you go looking for it. And I feel like you probably find, like if you're clear on it, you will find better prices and bargains of things than you would have without it, right? If you just listen to, oh wow, the square footage, like, oh, it's fantastic, you've got this massive apartment,
Yeah.
but it's all the toilet. The toilet's huge.
It's literally yeah. You walk in, there's a door, a bed, and then the rest of it is just a fucking bathroom.
Like a walk-in wardrobe or something, but the reality is your bedroom's tiny. But
yeah,
anyway, I'm sure this doesn't happen very often, but the point remains the same.
Yeah.
So yeah, moving on to the next part. So the metric revolution, empowering the state. The transformation to standardized measurements, known as the metric revolution, was driven by three key factors. The first was the growth of market exchanges, which necessitated consistent measurement standards for the ease of trade. The second factor stemmed from the Enlightenment ideals and public support, both of which favoured a unified measurement standard in France. Lastly, the French Revolution and Napoleon's subsequent nation-building efforts played a crucial role in implementing and spreading the metric system across France and its territories. And the first bit was really quite interesting because it makes sense. If you're doing trade, there was probably some sort of pressures to standardize things to allow trade to be facilitated more easily. If you can have like a standard measurement for and pricing based upon weight. I mean, as we still run off these things now. Like you buy fruit and stuff relatively based off weight, even meat, for example, right? Because it just makes it easier.
Yeah. I mean,
if you have to do it on something else, it would be difficult. Like, the fat content, the shape, that would just take too long. So just like, okay, weigh it on a scale. Okay, here's the price. So.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, what is money if not just a standardized currency, right? A means of like being able to buy things. And you can just see how like, people used to trade shells and things like that. But then it just got to a point where like, okay, let's try and create some kind of standardized metric which we can all share in.
We can all agree on.
And so you can...
this means this. This means £1 means £1 or whatever. Or $1 means $1.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the role of commerce in standardizing measurements. Large-scale trade and commercial exchanges are powerful motivations for the standardization of measurements. While small-scale transactions like grain trading could operate with a variety of measures, extensive commercial activities over long distances required a common standard for efficiency and transparency. This standardization helps streamline processes between unknown buyers and sellers, as we just said. Next part. So the emergence of a homogeneous citizenry in early modern France. The unification of measurement systems was intertwined with the political concept of uniform citizenship. In an era where legal inequalities existed among different troops, there are also disparities in measurement rights. The encyclopedists of the Enlightenment saw the plethora of measurements, laws, and regulations as obstacles to French unity. He advocated for centralizing reforms to establish a single national community with uniform laws, measures, and customs. This vision of national citizenship aimed at fair and equal conditions across the kingdom, seeking not just administrative ease, but also a transformation of the French populace. The goal is to replace a mosaic of local communities with a nationally legible society from the centre, fostering unity through uniformity in customs, beliefs, and actions, thus creating the concept of the French citizen. And that is quite interesting as well, because obviously if you can get everybody to conform to certain beliefs, methods, laws, measurements, it then obviously easily becomes more legible as well, right?
Yeah.
It's once again, these are systems around promoting manageability of a population.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that is the goal. If you want to take taxation, if you want to conscribe people to an army, you need to know the population that you currently manage, I guess. It's the same as what gets measured gets managed, is that type of adage, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's just interesting to see it on, like, you think of it obviously from a business perspective, you think, oh yeah, we're measuring this, and this, but it's exactly the same for the government, right? It's like they're trying to find ways to make sure they're measuring certain things so that they can manage these numbers.
Yeah. And I think it's somewhat inevitable, and it's also a bit of like a double-edged sword, right? Like in this case, I can understand the idea of knowing who your citizens are, so that if you have to go to war, you can, there could be conscription. But then at the same time, that information can also be used to benefit people's agendas. And it's like, how much? Where's the cutoff point? Where is too much information? In that, like today, with social media, fucking hell, I mean, they have every piece of information on us. And that's not for like the benefits, it's for the benefit of massive companies who want to make money, who want to sell their products. That's what our information is being used today. It's not like there is a proper purpose behind it. Yeah.
It's depressing.
It is. All right, so moving on. So measuring land tenure, the formation of the cadastral map. Modern states' drive for fiscal and administrative efficiency mirrors the principles of scientific forestry, particularly in standardizing and documenting land ownership. The varied traditional forms of land tenure were seen as too complex to accommodate. Liberal states typically simplify land ownership into individual freehold tenures. Here, land is owned by legal entities with rights to use it, inherit it, or sell it, evidenced by a standardized title deed backed by state law. The epitome of this process is the cadastral map, a detailed, scale-accurate survey of land holdings. These maps linked to property registries identify each parcel and its owner, primarily for tax purposes. This system parallels scientific forestry methods where maps and records facilitate resource exploitation. And you can see how this is like, I mean, a prime example, right, is like Africa, when it was like broken up into different countries for the benefit of the British, the French, and the Dutch. And they'll be like, this place is more gold, I want that, or this place is mountains, this has loads of timber, like you can this has loads of slaves. You can literally imagine them constructing countries and simplifying such complexity to an extent that is unfathomable to comprehend, right? Like imagine all these different tribes and all these cultures, and then someone goes in and be like, nah, there's not enough trees on that side, I want this, I want that, and absolutely destroying it. And there's still war, the Congo is an absolute shit show, because it's just still, there's so many repercussions from what they did back then. But yeah, you can understand how the cadastral map is just this framework to be applied to something to benefit, certain people or countries or whatnot. Initial goals of cadastral maps. Cadastral maps were created to bring precision, clarity, generality, and uniformity to land ownership and taxation. Their primary function was to facilitate a tax system that directly linked each land parcel to its owner, who bore the tax responsibility. The state's previous lack of detailed knowledge stemmed from the intricacies of local production and deliberate underreporting by local officials to lessen tax and conscription burdens. They often manipulated data to reduce their obligations. Cadastral maps and registries aim to eliminate these feudal practices and streamline tax collection, similar to how a scientific forester catalogues trees for optimal commercial use. While these maps make local and land ownership transparent to external authorities, local communities already familiar with land holdings and their values have less need for such detailed mapping. Yeah, and that's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's funny how like a lot of this just stems from like tax, as in like, you know, the king just wants more money.
Extraction.
Like,
Yeah, extraction of the population.
Exactly.
Like, it sounds like it sounds bad when you put it that way, but it like that is technically what it is. It's extraction of money from the population for collective benefits, let's just say. Well, that was the original objective.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so where the cadastral map gets it wrong. The advantage of the cadastral map for the state lies in its uniformity and standardization. The idea is that the same objective criteria can be applied throughout the country to produce a comprehensive and clear map of all property holdings, regardless of local differences. The map's simplicity, which results from its abstract nature, is crucial to its completeness. However, this simplicity often leads to a mismatch between the state's expectation and the reality of rural life. The farmer's experience is rarely average, with crops and weather conditions varying greatly. This has resulted in many rural tax revolts throughout history. The rigid and uniform nature of the cadastral system makes it difficult to fairly administer, as it fails to take into account the complexity of the farmer's experience. Similarly, the scientific forestry schemes are limited in their ability to reflect the intricacies of the natural forest. One major limitation of the cadastral map and the assessment system is that it only considers the land's value as a productive asset or commodity for sale, ignoring its importance for subsistence or the local ecosystem. The values of the land for purposes such as aesthetics, rituals, or sentiments are completely disregarded.
Yeah. That is, I guess, what happens when you just turn everything into like, oh, the size of this land equals this amount of money. Okay. Everything becomes about that then, right? If that makes sense. Like you have that link rather than it's impossible to measure the value of rituals and sentiments and the value it has to people outside of these frameworks, just because once again it's in the subjective realm, and because you can't put a number to it, it's harder to like apply administration to it, right? It's like
absolutely. But once again, going back to what we were saying earlier, you know, there's a reason for doing these things. There is a reason for mapping out a country and figuring out where people's lots of land are, right? There is probably a benefit to it to some extent. But when you start to simplify and assimilate, you know, reality to your framework, then and you get like repercussions from it, then you need to factor that in. That's where that feedback mechanism comes in. When people start to revolt or like, oh, this isn't fair because our crops in this area of the country don't get enough sunlight and so we can't make as much as the people up north or down south or whatever, then you factor that in, right? And then you start to make a much better, you're like, oh, okay, so there's more to this than meets the eye, rather than just like still bulldozing through and being like, it's all the same.
Well, it's the Nassim Taleb argument for decentralization. Like if you have local authorities who help create like varied rules and regulations for their own small area, that allows more diversity across the country, right? The whole idea of central planning is flawed in that respect, because you can't know, like you just said, all the complexities of all the different places. You just average out everybody and you just assume or put a blanket rule for everybody. Whereas if you have a decentralized state, for example, where, but like with the US, we have all these different states, you have different rules within the states, and therefore you can manage them better because you've got a smaller area to manage. And therefore it makes it more manageable, right? Because you can take into account more of the complexities. And like, it's almost like a hierarchy tree, isn't it? Like the abstractions go up further and further, right? To the point where at the very top, all you get is an average across the whole of the map. Whereas obviously in the individual areas, you have all these more intricate, I guess, statistics and data. But obviously once you get up to the top, it's all averaged out across the country to like, oh, this is the south, this is the west, this is the east. Yeah. And then you have one for the entire country, which is obviously so far removed from the actual realities of the local areas.
And that's the thing, and I wonder whether like it would be better off having a system whereby the centralized aspect of something, because you would need to have some kind of centralized but also local at the same time. But the centralized aspect only makes decisions on things that almost don't have like a local like impact. Do you know what I mean? They're more like very generalized decisions.
More like foreign policies, maybe, or something like that. Something where they can, speak for the collective
I mean,
against or towards the rest of the world rather than inside the country, because you can't make the best decisions for inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it's an argument for why people voted for, well, one argument for why people voted for Brexit is because it's the decentralization from the EU. I mean, there is no one could win an argument saying that the UK is like Europe, as in the UK is like Spain, the UK is like Italy. I mean, they're completely different countries, completely different cultures. And if someone who's not even like one of those countries is making decisions for them, well, then it's not locally sourced whatsoever. So you can understand, think of Brexit what you want, but like, there is an argument for that in that sake, right?
Yeah.
Because why would the EU
central
get
planners
to...
were in Europe,
Yeah, and that's it. They're not even a country in themselves. They just get to make decisions for other countries, Yeah, it's interesting.
It's a weird situation when you describe it like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on. So we got how shorthand formulas create incentives to game. So the tax formulas used by officials don't just observe reality, they often shape it, akin to a fiscal version of the Heisenberg principle. This transformation occurs as people adapt to game the system. For instance, France's door and window tax, levied based on the number of windows and doors as a proxy for property size, led to architectural changes to reduce tax liability. This highlights not just the impact of state simplifications, but also how society can adapt, resist, or even defy these impositions. There's often a discrepancy between an official land records and actual land usage, a gap that becomes especially apparent during social unrest. Even in stable times, unofficial land tenure practice might differ significantly from state records, underscoring that local customs may not align with state design theories. So yeah, two things. I enjoyed the whole, like, in the book he talks a lot about the door window tax and basically people just like removing windows. They were just basically making one door just so they had less tax. It's just so funny. And then what was the other point about? I'm just going to go here. Oh, that was it. So there's another thing with the state design sort of theories and understanding of a location. I don't know when they update their maps, let's just say. So let's just say you build an extension that didn't exist before, but you build it by
interesting.
They don't know it exists until they find it, and therefore there's plenty of things within their maps that are going to be completely wrong with the country, because there's always going to be people who subvert laws and don't give a crap and do stuff to their buildings without permission. I mean, in my head, the whole reason why you almost need permission is so they can actually know the change and have it mapped out. That is, in my head now, for knowing all this, I would assume that as well. Obviously, one of the reasons is to, I guess, have power over it. I don't know. But then the other part is obviously to log it in their cadastral map. Like, this person added an extension. This is the size of their house now. That's
a good point.
They rely on people providing that information, and people will hide that information. And they always have, always will. So then, like, once again, there's just points that it's never going to be 100% accurate because you're relying on people telling the truth. It's almost why studies to some degree and surveys to some degree also can be false, because you rely on some people to give you answers which they might not. Like, they might just hide the truth or whatever. There is the capability to deceive. And once you have the capability to deceive, it's never going to be truly representative.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you're never going to have a cadastral map that is actually reflective of.
So that's why you've got to take it as like a guide.
Yeah.
Rather than an absolute reality, because the truth is, you can't know about something that you didn't know about, right? And the only way you can know about it is if people come through the official ways of knowing about it. And if they don't, it exists. But your map doesn't, or your theories don't account for it. So.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And they're like fundamentally opposites of their nature, right? Like a map, to map something, you have to have an approach to mapping that. And to do that, you have to simplify some of the complexity. You have to disregard some of the...
I wonder if the architectural system was set up as well. So obviously when you build a house from the ground up, the architectural system obviously maps it out in terms of sizing square feet, and then that's obviously fed up to the government. So when they know what the land's being used for, they know all the sizes of the properties. And it's almost like a way of systemizing the creation of new buildings. They all have it mapped out immediately from the get-go.
Probably, yeah.
I've seen that happen. So it must happen.
Yeah.
I
would assume so. All right, so the origins of the modern state. The cadastral survey was just one tool in the arsenal of the modern utilitarian state. Unlike the pre-modern state that only needed basic information to maintain order, collect taxes, and raise armies, the modern state aimed to take control of the nation's physical and human resources and improve their productivity. This required a more comprehensive understanding of the society. therefore creating an inventory of land, population, income, occupation, resources, and deviance was a logical starting point. The state's evolving goals influenced the type of information collected. For instance, 19th century Prussia emphasized tracking the age and gender of migrants to prevent draft evasion and maintain military readiness. This shift towards gathering more detailed data on various aspects like health, education, and resources signified an expansion and intensification of the state's traditional objectives in a modern context. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? Also, it's interesting based on what is your current state of a country, and then it will determine which values or what its goals are, right? And then which values it's going to hone in on.
100%. It's well, like you said, what's the current objective? You can look at COVID, for example. What's the current objective? Is to try and protect the health of the country. How do you do that? We have to monitor the health as intricately as possible, so we're going to put all these restrictions on. We're going to get people to do tests. We're going to get people to self-diagnose, and we're going to ping people, whatever. It's that type of, it's just interesting because that is kind of where this has come from. Yeah, because the goal obviously changed. They now need new information to manage that goal.
Really interesting. So naming practices as a state tool. The social categorizations we use today originated from state efforts to standardize and simplify, such as the adoption of permanent surnames. These state-imposed naming conventions like mapping were often tied to taxation and met with resistance. Historical uprisings like the 1381 Wat Tyler Rebellion in England were partly fueled by tax registrations and assessments. Widespread use of last names, a relatively modern concept, facilitated the tracking of property, inheritance, taxes, legal matters, military conscription, and public health. The move towards a comprehensive population inventory, coupled with emerging concepts of citizenship, including voting and conscription, played a key role in standardizing these naming practices. And I love. Once again, we've talked about this on metabolical, but I love understanding or figuring out where certain historical things that you take it for norms now, what's the history behind them, surnames and things like that. I find that so interesting. It's like with certain surnames where they're called Williamson. It means son of William and stuff like that. Son of William, exactly.
Yeah.
I love that. Because you never question it. You just take it as it comes.
Man, it's interesting that we don't really question a lot of the things that we kind of, like you said, we just take everything that we know for granted to some degree. We don't really understand the origins of where these things came from. Also, why do we have names? Why isn't it numbers? I guess that's so inhumane. But you know what I mean? There is technically a choice there. Yeah. Well, then you definitely would be bloody livestock, wouldn't you? If you're I'm human number really 1,561 or something crap.
And they did do that, didn't they? I mean, they did do that during the Second World War. So with the Jews and the Nazi camps, that is
proper dehumanization there, fucking hell.
Yes, yeah. So state tool, standardizing language. Using a specific language can act as a barrier, shielding a community from external comprehension and preserving its cultural identity, history, and heritage. The linguistic exclusivity often poses a challenge to state control and can underpin autonomy. The push towards a standardized language, like French in France, often places the dominant culture represented by institutions like Académie Française at the top of cultural hierarchy. This process relegates local dialects to mere provincialism. Mastery of the standard language opens doors to social and material benefits, while non-compliance can lead to disadvantages. Such efforts by the state are not just about cultural unification, but also about asserting control and centralizing power.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? When you're reading it, I was just thinking, oh wow, it makes you. It's so weird to think that there's a central authority of the language. It's we are the ones who know and decide what the correct way of doing things is. And I'm like, whoa, that's actually is nuts. Because technically there is, to some degree, there is no right or wrong way to speak any language if you've communicated what you want to communicate in my head. Because that's the sole goal of it. Yeah. But the idea that you can have levels to it, and to be the perfecting master, you have to be this level, and then you could be the hierarchy of culture. And it kind of makes sense to some degree where where accents come into play as well. If you could speak in a certain accent, you almost, seen as more intelligent. I know for a fact in France, for example, the Parisian French and they are very on top of the sort of grammar and stuff. And if you don't speak like they do, you're almost inferior straight away. It's just nuts.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I find that so interesting. And also, like, you look at different dialects today, and obviously they're the same language, but you can also imagine going back in time and how they were different language, and this is just them evolving to adopt, the common language of their nation now. It's interesting.
Yeah. Cool. So on to the summary so far. So modern state officials are often detached from the societies they administer, and their perception is shaped by the simplified tools they use. Tools like maps, censuses, and standardized measurements are fundamental for governance, yet they distill complex realities into basic categories. This simplification aids in understanding and data collection, but it inevitably leads to a partial grasp of societal nuances. As Charles Tilly noted, the development and application of these abstractions have significantly bolstered state power, giving officials unprecedented direct insight and influence over society. So, moving on to part 2, transforming visions. So, the pursuit of legibility by the state, the downside to legibility. State officials' continuous quest to deeply understand society, known as the project of legibility, involves using tools, as we discussed, maps, censuses, and measurements. These simplifications, while informative, are often tainted by inaccuracies, omissions, and biases. The drive behind these efforts, despite technological advances, remains largely focused on control, manipulation, and appropriation. This detailed classification of societal segments, however, can lead to detrimental outcomes. An example of this is was the map used in Amsterdam during the Nazi occupation, which led to the deportation of 65,000 Jews, made only possible by data from population and business registries. The ability of government to effectively control and manipulate society hinges on its capability to identify and monitor various components like citizens or land parcels. This visibility is essential for various state functions, like health programs or taxation. The level of information needed correlates with the scale of the intervention. Thus, more ambitious manipulative efforts necessitate greater legibility. While increasing legibility augments the state's capacity for specific actions, it's crucial to recognize that such power can be wielded for both beneficial and harmful purposes, as we just said about the Nazi occupation, which is crazy to think. Like, they almost obviously just kick down the buttons hatches of like the government, like, right, where's the registry? It's nuts to think that, because if that data is there, it just makes sense that it obviously could be used for good and bad.
Yeah.
But also, who defines what's good and bad to some degree, right? Like,
and good and bad can change all the time, right?
Exactly. And this is the reason that, like, the political decisions are like made sort of thing, like who you put into power, because they're going to wield this information in different ways, right?
Yeah. And think about it, because you can imagine when Jews were registering their religion, right? They probably didn't see this coming. And it's the same thing that, like, today we give so much of our information away. And yes, okay, there's like a bit of chat about it, like, oh, they shouldn't sell it to third companies and blah, blah, blah. But we also I feel like we can't really perceive the possible ramifications of giving away such information,
Until it's too late.
Because it could be anything. I mean, there could be any kind of government that comes into power and is like, oh, we value this, anyone who's against this value, and now they have all the information to determine who in society is like that, right? It's so interesting. It's also terrifying.
Because also it is terrifying, because you're right, the more information they have on you, the more selective they can be on their filtering for when, let's just say, it's not going to happen, they want to eradicate a very specific type of person, like this person who went to this city, this type of thing, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, this is not going to happen, but the reality is they can find this information and be able to filter a specific name list, where they live, what they do.
I think there's also
probably find their IP address, probably find out everything about them, see all their text messages, like, okay, these are the guys, we'll just take them out silently,
It's pretty scary. And I think there's also now, because of the complexity of information that they have, you can start to identify patterns. So even if you can't identify something in particular, you can be like, oh, these kinds of people do this, 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 and this, and this, right? So then you're already starting to like identify what kind of behaviors those kinds of people are doing. I think that's scary. All right, so understanding states simplification in governance. Firstly, these simplifications capture only the data deemed relevant for official purposes. Secondly, they predominantly exist in written formats using either textual descriptions or numerical data. Thirdly, these records are typically static, representing a snapshot in time. Fourthly, they often compile individual data points into collective metrics like transportation network density or statistics on unemployment and literacy. Finally, the comprehensive analysis. Officials standardize the data, enabling them to categorize and assess populations in averages or distributions, facilitating broader governance measures. Yeah.
I think the idea of being static and snapshot in time is quite interesting as well.
Yeah.
Because it's never up to date to some degree, right? Like, because if you're always looking at the past, things might have changed by the next time the next snap is taken, you know?
Yeah. We call it a cross-sectional design in when I was at uni, when you're picking a type of statistical design. Cross-section is literally like a snapshot, but it's terrible because it's a reflection of what? That specific time, and you can choose what time you want. I mean, if you're looking for something and you're trying to, get a particular result, well, then I'm going to pick the peak right here, even though I know it's about to drop, but that won't be reflected in the results. So, yeah.
I got you.
Yeah.
Cool. So on to the next part, understanding state simplification. So state simplification entails two primary processes in the representation of knowledge. Firstly, it involves presenting information in a consistent, repeatable manner, applicable across different scenarios. This leads to facts being framed in a streamlined, schematic way, categorized into broader classes. Secondly, the assimilation of comprehensive data often means overlooking or amalgamating details that might be important in other contexts. State authorities wield the power to enforce these simplifications as they have the means to impose their structured categorizations. Over time, these artificially created categories by surveyors, census officials, and other state agents, through initially abstract, become embedded in everyday life through state institutions, influencing societal perceptions and experiences. I think it's quite interesting this because there's also something to be said for like race in this as well, by categorizing by race.
Yeah.
You're almost creating race by the element of categorization.
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean? Like, there is from the genetic code, there is no there's minor differences between races, right? In fact, apparently there is no difference, right?
Yeah.
And it's just like, okay, well, we've then just created these categories that don't really exist apart from in our minds, and by solidifying them, they become more important. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I was just reading the identity book, and he talks a lot about it, and like, if you make these categories more prominent, they become a reality.
Yeah.
If you talk about them a lot, it's
you
the whole
shine
reason,
you
the race
shine
and
a
gender
spotlight
issues.
on the perceived differences, even though there
Yes.
aren't differences. And I think that's it. Like, I remember reading that in the Coddling of the American Minds, and I felt a lot of that during the kind of Black Lives Matter kind of movement, because it almost was proliferating racism. No, I'm not saying that they weren't justified in it, but it was almost proliferating racism by constantly highlighting the differences rather than the commonalities. And in the Coddling of the American Minds, this woman, she says, they draw a circle around them, I draw a circle around us. So it's like they're drawing a circle around their differences, and I'm drawing a circle around the commonalities. And it's like the commonalities you want to hone in on, not the differences, because then you're just hammering home how different you are, rather than the shared commonalities. And that's the thing that bind people together. I think in a weird way, and I remember watching Morgan Freeman, and he was like, "Oh, what do you think about, was it Black History Month?" And he's like, "There's a month," and they're like, "What do you think of it?" He's like, "I think you should just stop talking about it. Just stop bringing it up. It was not present until you brought it up, right? Like, no one was thinking about race until you brought it up." And I think that's an interesting point with the whole categorization attempt, and especially now, where we're such a mixed society. We're mixed cultures all the time. So if you're mixed race and you have loads of different things in you, then how do you categorize that? Do you start to be like, oh, someone who's Serbian and Indian, or someone who's Croatian and Swiss, or something like that? I mean, how do you categorize that now, right? It starts to become more and more complex, and it's just I don't see. There's no point in it, I feel. Yeah. Interesting. Probably a bit of a rant for me, sorry.
No, it is interesting. It's just, I do find the whole idea of where you draw the line just really interesting. Obviously, like you just said, the more you focus on it, the more prevalent it becomes, the more it becomes talked about. But like, why are we even using these? Like, surely there could be other categories that might be better than this. And I guess you'd almost call these categories like sub-facets of your identity to some degree. They're like identity labels, aren't they?
Yeah.
Like your country of birth, your race, whatever, is all part of what people believe to be a facet and an important part of an identity. But it shouldn't have to be. But it's because it's been categorized and used for so long and being socially reinforced that it still exists. I do think like sub-facets, identities, you're never going to get rid of them because people need them to navigate socially. To understand who somebody is, they need to have these like identity labels. But I do think sometimes it's a good idea to rethink the categories we currently have and be like, are they actually that useful? Is there a better way we can categorize this, right? And see,
why are we placing value on this?
Exactly that. And on that topic, we should definitely at some point maybe even do The Lies That Bind Us, that one I read recently on identity, because it talks exactly about this. It like broke it down into like, creed being religion, race, culture, like how these are all sub-facets of identities and categories that we all have for each other. And he's like, they're all flawed in ways, like, and he proves why they're flawed. But he's also like, but we still need these labels because otherwise the world's too complex. Because if I have to treat everybody as an individual, fuck me, there's 7 billion people to individually compute and figure out, So we need these like labels and subcategorizations of like even like the personality test. Oh, this guy's open-minded. This guy's. You need these labels to try and make sense of other people because otherwise it'd just be impossible. But the point being, we have these categories that have been given to us, and we just need to rethink: are they even valuable as categories now? Is there a way we can create another category which like? But once again, this defeats the whole object of legibility, because if you have a million different options to categorize people, you can't have a system that does that, right? So it has to be these broad categories that I guess we've all come to agree upon.
It's difficult. It's a difficult one to figure out, that's for sure, because it's like almost like Pareto's principle as well. It's like, what's the 20% of the categories that actually matter, right? Like, it's like, what are the ones that make a difference, but do we need to categorize based on I
guess interestingly, the stuff like date where you were born is quite an interesting one, because then you can define somebody as somebody who's an immigrant or not. So that's quite an interesting one from a state perspective, right?
But
like, where were you born? Because then you know that, okay, this person came here, right?
If
that makes sense. And it's good for them to know how many people are coming in, how many people are leaving the country, etc., right? But also, so I can understand why they want that.
But also, like, we're talking about this from the angle of identity, right? So we're already like kind of simplifying things based on just that approach, rather than like, for instance, you have doctors, and when they have like patients, they'll give them a form to be like, oh, where are you from? What's your ethnicity? Right? And the ethnicity matters because there are biological differences, right? And so there is a difference between, and I'm going to butcher this, but it's like Afro-Caribbean and African or something like that, right?
Okay.
And although identity-wise, it might not like, well, maybe people identify with it differently, but you can see how from this angle, from a medical perspective, you now need to know different information. So already it's like, it becomes very complex. Anyway, moving on. So, forming complex truths through aggregated facts. Standardizing and aggregating facts involves a 3-step process. Firstly, there's the creation of common measurement units or codes like tree size classes, threefold tenure systems, metric measurements for land and grain, uniform naming systems, prairie land divisions, and standardized urban lots. Secondly, each entity is quantified and categorized using these units. For instance, a tree is classified by size, a land parcel is plotted on a cadastral map, jobs are sorted into employment categories, and individuals are named following a standardized system. And finally, this process yields collective data, such as tree counts by size, population demographics, farm sizes, or health statistics like tuberculosis cases. These data, when cross-referenced, reveal intricate patterns like correlating tuberculosis prevalence with socioeconomic factors and geographic location in cities. That's interesting, isn't it? Just goes to show you the kind of like the evolution of how it all comes about.
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting here as well, like how things come to be quantified and categorized using the units. Like, you know, we get put into employment categories and individuals named following a standardized system. It's just, like how, like a tree is classified by size. We've then, by then proxy, decided that size is the most important variable.
Yeah.
Such as when we decide what job we're in, the employment category is now an important variable in life. Nothing to do with other things that could be important within a human life. You know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting how you can see how this starts to change your perception of different things, can't you? Because it attributes an association to it. Oh, a tree is based on size, right? Or a farm is based on land. So then before you might not have had an association to how to measure it, and now you do, and now you start to see things through that measurement. It starts to change your perception of them, and I think that's quite interesting. Yeah,
once again, also with like the stuff like size, it almost implies use to some degree, or not. It doesn't necessarily imply use, sorry, but it kind of hints at it, because you're like, oh well, if it's bigger, it's got more size, and I can use more of it. Kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So yes, moving on, we got the understanding the modern map. So state simplifications, much like maps, are designed to capture specific aspects of a complex world that interest their creators, while disregarding others. So criticizing a map for lacking detail is only valid if it fails to include information crucial for its intended purpose. A map is a tool with an objective, which can be judged as either noble or objectionable, but its effectiveness depends on how well it serves its designed function. So the transformative impact of maps stems not from the maps themselves, but from the authority and intent of those utilizing them. For instance, a corporation focused on maximizing timber yields will map and manipulate its environment to align with its objective, exerting its influence to ensure the dominance of its mapping logic. And you can obviously just see, I think we said this before about how capitalism to some degree has this within itself. Like the mapping logic of capitalism is the objective of increasing money or producing more, right? It's and therefore in itself it's imposing this mapping logic, and therefore we always refer to certain things, and our value systems are defined by this mapping logic, whether we like it or not. Which I thought was super interesting, because whoever basically sets the map sets the objective, sets everything, and therefore everything is viewed through these lenses.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And there's like an underlying logic, right? For example, like things follow logically from. So, for example, if the objective is to maximize timber yields, you will then disregard other things that could be objectively useful or could be another way of doing it, and you completely ignore it and you just focus on this one thing. You forget that alternative paths or alternative ways of doing things exist.
Yeah, you really do. It's really interesting as well, because like, okay, let's say you're building. Do you build a map with the intention of mapping it in a particular way, or is the map built in a particular way that is then used in that way, right? So either way, you're kind of assimilating reality to a predetermined map. Do you get what I mean? As in, so it can either be based on the person who designs the map or the person who uses the map, and will be biased in that way. I think that's quite interesting. Because there's no such thing as just like an objective map, right? Because you're mapping a particular property. And so someone who's designing that map is obviously either biased towards a particular property, or the person who is using that map is going to be using it for that particular property.
I'm just trying to think as well of, like, for example, like a map that you need to use for driving, and it includes like mountains. It's like technically they're not necessary to the map. You just get rid of them. All you need is the roads. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So, catastrophes in state development. Many catastrophic events in state development during the late 19th and 20th centuries stem from the perilous combination of three elements. Firstly, there's the ambition to administratively order nature and society, akin to what's seen in scientific forestry, but on a grander scale, often termed high modernism. Secondly, these plans often involved the unchecked exercise of state power. And lastly, a crucial factor was the presence of a weak or vulnerable civil society unable to counteract these ambitions. When an undemocratic ruling elite pursue these utopian ideals with unrestrained power, and society lacked the means to oppose, the consequences were often disastrous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we touched on some of those points earlier, but yeah, just what the running theme once again is hubris, belief of that we know what's best as well for society, followed by the ability to do it, and then also measurement systems that don't actually reveal reality, but they think they reveal reality and they use it as ways to manipulate society.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, the evolution of the state's role in society. So the state's use of simplification and rationalization, previously confined to areas like forestry and taxation, expanded to encompass the entire societal structure. This shift marked the onset of a large-scale social engineering, with the state assuming the primary role over private entities. This new vision of the state's purpose was transformative, focusing on enhancing the well-being of society at large, rather than solely augmenting sovereign wealth and power. Statistical data about the population empowered the state with a deeper understanding of its citizens, similar to scientific forestry's insights into its forests. This evolution in state function opened limitless possibilities for managing and transforming society based on contemporary moral and scientific principles, transforming society from a historically and customarily shaped entity to one actively managed, potentially engineered by the state. And that's a really, really good point that this whole book sort of like covers, or like the whole purpose of this book is to sort of see it for what it is. And the societies are now changing their goals from previously just taxation and stuff, and they're now turning to other objectives because we now have the ability to measure all these different other things, which we can then set objectives and targets for. I feel like we were talking about the COVID thing and health. The more active roles they take, the more data they're going to need to do this. And it just goes to show there is some sort of level of like objective creep that's going on here. And the thing that worries me the most, I think, is the fact that we don't get to define these goals. People who think they know best for the average person tend to define these goals and then try and create solutions, or try and create, or try and gather the data to pursue these things, of which we almost have no say in to some degree. You're on mute, by the way. You're on mute.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's quite scary as well, because it's very incremental. You almost don't see it coming. It changes very slowly, I feel. And before you know it, you're kind of pushed down behaving in a particular way because someone has created the objective for you, Yeah. Yeah, I really know. Yeah.
Cool. So we got understanding high modernism. So high modernism's central flaw lies in its over-reliance on scientific knowledge as the sole means to improve human life, often discounting other forms of understanding. Characterized by a departure from historical and traditional norms, high modernism advocates for rethinking and redesigning everything through scientific rationale. It inherently supports an authoritarian mindset, privileging those with scientific expertise as the only qualified decision makers and sidelining or re-educating dissenters. High modernism prioritizes the domination of nature for human benefit and safety, resonating with those who gain status and power from this perspective. This ideology is typically embraced by bureaucrats, technicians, planners, and engineers who play pivotal roles in nation building and societal restructuring. And mate, Tiva, we've done a few podcasts on some of these books which explore these sort of themes, and this idea of scientific knowledge allowing us to decide the best cause or the best way for humanity being almost impossible because there's no such thing as a sort of scientific way of analyzing the value structures of humans.
Yeah.
And therefore this what's the word? Overemphasis on using science to figure out things we should be doing is just flawed from the start, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, once again, earlier on, he's talking about local versus centralized, or contextual versus centralized. And I think science in this regard stands as this kind of objective, centralized kind of way of measuring things, or way of like dictating behavior. And it kind of goes against the very point, right? Like it's not contextual. All the context has been pulled out of it. It's this abstract point that, like, you know, people have researched or found out, but it's not really applicable, you know?
Yeah.
And you can see how trying to apply it can distort reality because you're trying to make it fit.
I mean, yeah, what's really interesting as well is if you think about the sort of like the philosophy of science and the stuff we read around that, like a lot of science is obviously one, proving things wrong, but also trying to instill doubt in knowledge and then trying to refine knowledge. Whereas running a country to some degree, you can't have that level of like second guessing. You have to make decisions based upon the best information. And that doesn't really work in my head with the scientific rationale, which is more laborious, long, and takes time. It's just so interesting to see as well, because as a rule, scientists shouldn't really agree on things, right? Because they should be competing to understand what is the truth and therefore fighting every single point to try and be like, okay, what is the reality here? And I think it's so interesting when you think about looking back at like the COVID situation, where you have one side fighting the other and then people just poo-pooing the people who were trying to have like a scientific debate. And it came very much about, you know, it was the ad hominem attacks. Oh, these guys are all like fake scientists, all this. There wasn't like an actual argument based on the actual science. But then I was saying this before, it's so hard to manage and convey information to people if the information is like, we actually don't know, we're figuring it out. And unfortunately, this attitude as well from the high modernism isn't that. It isn't like, oh, we're figuring it out. It's like, this is what we know. We're doing this kind of thing. And they don't really focus on this. So it's not really science of anything. It's like in the guise of science.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, I think if you're to look at, you know, how societies have evolved, and, you know, I remember Noah Harari talking about it. You know, a tribe can get to like, what is it, 150 people before they need like a, you know, some kind of leader to an extent. And then obviously that like scales up. And you can imagine how, okay, so a society develops, it becomes too big, it starts to have like people in charge. Those people in charge have to form some way of organizing that tribe or that city or that country. And then to organize that, they're acting as a centralized like government. And so you want something that's objective, right? Because you're not going to deal with each one. You want to try and please everyone. And so you can understand how science is used to kind of back up these kind of organizational methods. But actually, in a way, it kind of distorts it even more because it's not contextual, or it's not based on the local area.
Yeah. I mean, you can also, to some degree, always run experiments that prove the thesis that you want. And then if there's any that don't agree, you just delete them.
Yeah.
You know, as we sort of, I can't remember, was it metabolic? No, maybe it was metabolic. It was one of those books where they were just talking a lot about, in fact, no, it was the one about recovery, wasn't it?
Good to
go. She was talking about how, yeah, that's it, good to go. Where they're, you know, the people who were creating some of these products that using basically fake science, they were just hiding all the studies that disproved it and only promoting or publishing the ones that actually proved it. It's like, anybody can do that, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, and like, you know, we somewhat saw it during COVID as well. I mean, there were so many scientists saying different things, but realistically, at the end of the day, a government has to make a decision. How they make that decision, I mean, there's probably a lot of bias and a lot of like backhand deals going on anyway. But the fact is, they have to make a decision.
Yeah, and quickly, especially with stuff like that.
Exactly, and then get science to back it up even more. All right, so moving on. So modernism and city planning. In high modernism, formal simplicity and functional efficiency are not just parallel objectives. Rather, formal order is considered a prerequisite for efficiency. This belief underpins the rationale for segregating functions. Planning becomes simpler when each urban area, pedestrian path, or forest serves a single purpose. However, integrating multiple functions into one design introduces complexities, and accommodating diverse objectives can be daunting. Le Corbusier His urban planning philosophy exemplifies this approach, promoting single-purpose spaces and standardization. Yet the practical implementation of such urban designs faces real-world challenges. Planners must navigate the preferences, financial constraints, and resistance of various stakeholders, similar to how scientific foresters deal with nature's unpredictability and diverse stakeholder goals. Jane Jacobs critiqued this approach, arguing against the assumption that functional order equates to repetitive and standardized forms. She posits that complex systems often lack surface regularity and their deeper functional order is tied to their purpose, not their appearance. Jacobs championed a functionalist view, assessing structures based on their effectiveness in fulfilling intended roles, a perspective at odds with Le Corbusier's focus on visual uniformity. Her critique highlighted the need to understand the complex, multifunctional nature of urban spaces and structures. I'd like to read more around like the psychology of architecture and like how it like impacts people's mindset. I find it quite interesting. I remember like reading one, and it was like Paris, apparently, because the way that they design a lot of their buildings with the kind of spiraled staircases, it means that you naturally bump into your like, for some reason, you naturally bump into your neighbors a lot more than if you like standard blocks and how they're designed. And I just find that quite interesting because already you can see that that starts to build a bit of a culture with like where you live and being close. I say this, but like, do you know your neighbors?
Funny enough, we actually do.
Oh, okay. Well then, yeah.
Yeah. No, but like this was actually like consciously done sort of thing.
All right,
like,
fine. Okay.
Yeah. But do we? Yeah, we like. I wouldn't say. Yeah, we've met with our neighbours like once, I think twice. But yeah, you bump into them fair, but it's usually just like a quick.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And then scuttling off back into the back home.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting, this idea of like city planning and stuff with, you know, standardizing the shape of apartments and buildings and stuff. I think it makes sense from a purely economical perspective, and I find it interesting if you really think about it, where the richest people end up paying for super architects who create them the most unique buildings or functional buildings that they want, where they create something that they actually want, and obviously everybody else who just buys like a normal house or has to be standardized into like a box because it's the most cheap and effective way to produce. And it's just interesting because there's always going to be that dynamic, I think, where because of the economic constraints, it just makes more sense to standardize everything. And especially for people who are building houses, they're under pressures to create specific, shapes, because obviously it's the cheapest to produce a building that's just like a box and goes straight up, right?
Yeah.
Which is why, there is a difference between people who are super rich and obviously want to buy their own or create their own house from the ground up. They have an architect, they have a specific building company who'll do it. For the rest, we all just get the standard box.
Yeah, but
I don't know whether it's I think it is more economical than anything else. It's more like,
I think it's purely
especially from the people who build it. It's like, how can I've got this plot of land, how can I fit as many fucking apartments into this plot of land as legally possible? And then obviously they just build it in the way that's like the easiest to build also.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we're gonna have this shape, and therefore everything just is exactly the same going up. There's 10, 20 apartments, you buy 10, 20 apartments worth of materials. It is that type of mindset. It's scaling up through standardization, because the best way to scale is to standardize. If you can't scale stuff that's not standardized.
Yeah.
That's just like a rule. So
yeah, no, exactly. I think it's all economics based. I think we basically designed for one function and one function only, and I think that used to be different because especially prior to like World War One, we used to design things that actually looked nice. There was another component there, which was it's visually appealing. We just don't do that anymore. I mean, architecture today is fucking disgusting. It's just, they're just tissue boxes. That's literally it. Everything is just like, it looks like it was designed by some babies just stacking blocks. And now we're at this point where we've convinced ourselves that having no characteristics is the characteristic. We apply this minimalism to everything, and we think like, oh, it's so chic, it's so nice, it's so like elegant. It's just nothing. And you walk around and you're just in a concrete jungle where there is just nothing kind of like appealing to look at. And it does like, it's what I find crazy is how really basic buildings, like it from the Victorian times, like a public toilet has so much more character and is like, you know, design, and it almost looks beautiful to an extent than like, you know, fucking, I mean, take the ones that we have today on a Saturday night when guys go out and they have like on the piss, and so you have this like portable like kind of like pissing places, you know,
The little circles you mean,
yeah,
all
the
like
little
stare each other in the
circles.
eyes when you go for yeah.
Obviously they're slightly different, but it just goes to show you like it couldn't be like more different, you know.
Yeah.
Everything is about
sacred
one
anymore.
function, and there's an issue with that, because then, okay, what happens when that function goes? What happens when we no longer need offices anymore because a lot of people work from home? You know, what do you do with these buildings that were built for one purpose and one purpose only? Can you refit them? Can you redo them? And that's why like a lot of old buildings actually lend themselves really well, because they were multifunctional. They had multiple purposes. And so the coolest areas in London are the ones that are really old, have been like refitted and remade. You know, like the tobacco docks, or you know, coal drop yard in, you know, King's Cross. I mean, all of these that used to be for completely different things, but actually they're really cool now. Yeah. So another rant, but
No, a relevant rant.
a relevant rant, exactly.
There you go.
Yeah.
Cool. So moving on to the next part. So Lenin, the revolutionary visionary. So Lenin's revolutionary strategy mirrored Le Corbusier's urban planning ethos. Both viewed their tasks as complex, requiring expert implementation. Lenin, embodying high modernism, believed in a scientific, unified approach executed by an enlightened intelligentsia.
Intelligentsia, yeah.
Intelligentsia. He emphasized the vanguard party's role in guiding the proletariat, holding a monopoly on revolutionary knowledge. His ideology transcended national lines, framing class consciousness as an exclusive truth held by the party's leaders. Lenin likened ideological purity to hygiene, maintaining the party's sterile environment. Despite different arenas, Lenin and Le Corbusier shared a high modernist vision, prioritizing systematic solutions and dismissing traditional practices, albeit through authoritarian means. I thought this was just interesting how it's just like the way these people approached building or city planning is the same approach that that Lenin approached,
Yeah.
you know, sort of organizing his society as well. It just goes to show how damaging it can be.
Yeah, because you're trying to reduce reality to one function, right? To one component. And it's inevitable that others are going to pop up, right? Even if he was to design a building that had like one function, there normally will be other things that people use it for, right? And so those will start to like, you know, emerge, and yet then they will be suppressed. And in the case of Lenin, right, like he has one like purpose, he has one like goal, and then there will be other things that emerge, and he has to suppress it, because you're trying to force reality into this way of being. And I think that's literally what Matthias Desmet was saying in The Psychology of Totalitarianism, right? Trying to fit everything into this kind of totalitarian regime, the way that you think reality should run.
Exactly that.
So last part of this part, in the art of crafting history by victors. In the aftermath of a revolution, the accuracy of the history written by the victors is often secondary to its political utility. This sanitized, orderly narrative gains traction among the populace, bolstering their confidence in their leaders' vision and capabilities. Such historical accounts typically simplify the complexities of the revolutionary process to serve political ends. Revolutionary leaders like Lenin have a vested interest in portraying themselves as pivotal to the revolution's success. The crafted narrative, fitting the leader's ideological framework, consolidates their legitimacy and presents the revolution as a cohesive, inevitable progression. As these leaders transition the narrative of the revolution into an official record and education, they emphasize their strategic roles and minimize the influence of chance, framing their actions as both decisive and brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that if you've just done a revolution, you need to recreate the narrative so everybody's sort of on board. It just makes me really interested in like how many times, if your country's been built off like a revolution, then you're probably believing some lie, essentially.
To some extent, yeah. Oh, it's those national lies that we were talking about in Why They Just Lie.
Yeah,
you know, it's just like you want your country to be bound together, and what is something that, you know, finds people. Well, you come up with that, but
a narrative,
yeah,
of where you came from.
exactly.
So we're moving on to part 4. Part 3 was more case studies, so we decided to ignore it for this sort of book summary. And if you want to learn more about, I think it was Lenin was one of the chapters, then obviously get the book. So now moving on to part 4, which is the missing link, and this is all about the types of knowledge. So the short-term focus in scientific studies is not inherent to the scientific method. Rather, it arises from the institutional and commercial influences. The scientific method requires isolating specific variables and disregarding interaction effects outside of the experimental model, leading to a greater clarity in the outcomes. This clarity is advantageous, but it results in ignoring important aspects of reality, such as blind spots, peripheral details, and long-term implications. The relationship between scientific and practical knowledge is deeply entwined in a political struggle for dominance by experts and their institutions. In this light, approaches like Taylorism and scientific agriculture are seen not merely as production methods, but also as a means of control and exploitation.
Yeah.
I was going to say about the this idea of control, because obviously when you do science, you've got a control variable, right? And you're trying to like find out the influence of each variable of each other variable. But I feel like the reality is so many things, or so many complex systems, like the economy, for example, is impossible to isolate certain variables, and therefore, almost by proxy, is it then impossible to actually use the scientific method in a valid way.
Yeah.
Or in the way that it was intended to be used, right?
Mm-hmm. Because we isolate particular variables, like it says, and we're never going to be able to isolate all the different 100%. Variables because there are too many millions.
There's too many. There's many you don't even know. Variables you don't even know exist.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
To some degree.
Exactly. So you're almost approaching it from like in a systemic approach. If you're doing like a practical knowledge, in which case you get like systemic feedback rather than individual feedback, which which you could argue is more beneficial because it's more rooted in reality, or reflects reality more. So technical knowledge, the relation between episteme and techne. I don't know if you pronounce them that way, but
I still don't know. Well, let's just do it techne.
Yeah. A bit techno,
Techno music.
Yeah. For the Greeks, and particularly for Plato, episteme and techne represented knowledge of an order completely different from Mētis. Technical knowledge, or techne, could be expressed precisely and comprehensively in the form of hard and fast rules, not rules of thumb, principles and propositions. At its most rigorous, techne is based on logical deductions from self-evident first principles. Where Mētis is contextual and particular, techne is universal. In the logic of mathematics, 10 multiplied by 10 equals 100 everywhere and forever. Techne is characteristic above all of self-contained systems of reasoning in which the findings may be logically derived from the initial assumption. To the degree that the form of knowledge satisfies these conditions, to that degree is it impersonal, universal, and completely impervious to context. But the context of Mētis is characteristically situations which are transient, shifting, disconcerting, and ambiguous, situations which do not lend themselves to precise measurement, exact calculation, or rigorous logic. Yeah. I think it's quite important to obviously for him to mention those, because it just shows you the difference between almost something that is static or universal compared to something that is fluid and changing, something that can't be captured, something that can't be, captured in that little slit of time, the cross-sectional analysis.
Yeah.
Because it's consistently changing. So you have to approach it in a systemic approach to be able to capture all of it, because you can't just capture a little bit of it.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about this before, but this really links in with the master and his emissary, and also the matter with things, because it's almost like a reflection of the two sides of your brain, this types of knowledge, because one of them obviously tries to fix things and make them universal and static and
create rules.
Exactly, create rules. And the other part of your brain is way more, like you're saying here, it has the ability to understand the transient and the fluid. And it doesn't try and categorize things too much. It understands that things are changing. And I find it interesting that almost the categorizations of knowledge we've made almost reflect the fact that we literally have two sides of the brain which have different modes of being, or whatever McGilchrist was calling it.
No, it's it's a good point. Definitely. and we will definitely get onto him at some point. We promise.
Yeah, we did try, didn't we? I can remember a couple of years ago we tried to do National Democracy. I think we did like part 1. We should definitely go back, revisit that maybe in the new year or something, and the Matter of Things, because I remember that being
we'll put a bunch of months aside just to do,
No, genuinely, we should. It'd be really, really useful, especially off the back of some of these conversations. I think it links very, very nicely.
Oh my God, absolutely. Yeah, it's like the foundation of all books.
That's it.
It's the Bible.
Bible. It's the new Bible.
Yeah. Techne and Science. If the description of techne as an ideal or typical system of knowledge resembles the self-image of modern science, that is no accident. The actual practice of science, however, is something else again. The rules of techne are specifications of how knowledge is to be codified, expressed, and verified once it has been discovered. No rules of techne or episteme can explain scientific invention and insight. Discovering a mathematical theorem requires genius and perhaps Mētis. The proof of theorem, however, must follow the tenets of techne. Thus, the systematic and impersonal rules of techne facilitate the production of knowledge that can be readily assembled, comprehensively documented, and formally taught, but they cannot by themselves add to that knowledge or explain how it came into being. I think that's such an interesting point, this idea that realistically, we learn from practice, from being pragmatic, from actually like testing things. But then if we want to teach anyone else, it then transforms into a different type of knowledge, something that has to be codified and
it's more like you understand it through like intuition, right, to some degree, and then you have to explain the intuition, which is something you don't really have access to, but you have to then try and explore it and, like you say, codify it in that sense.
But it makes sense, doesn't it? Because experience is made up of so many different factors, right? It's like you're visually seeing something, you're hearing it, you're feeling it, you're embodying it, you're spiritually there, all these different things that you cannot communicate with someone else unless they have witnessed it and experienced it as well. But even then, to an extent, there is still a difference in how you perceive it or interpret something, in which case to translate that over to someone, the translation process, you have to simplify all of that into language, into this codified kind of knowledge. And that's interesting, because naturally you will lose some of the message. You will lose some of the community, there's some experience, because there's only so much that language can express, right?
For sure. I was also wondering then on that aspect why it's so hard sometimes to communicate abstract ideas, or scientific ideas, and sometimes it's better to try and use either like an analogy or an example, or like, how we're sort of like, we spoke about this so many times before at school, like we kind of learn formulas, we learn when it comes to science and stuff, right? We don't actually learn the problems these people are trying to solve where they came up with the formulas, and we miss that deeper context for the understanding. Does that make sense? Like we kind of get taught, here's the formula for this, here's why this happens, whatever, without actually understanding how did this person even discover this, or how are they even thinking about the problem, which I think is even more important than the codified rules to some degree. Like the codified rules have come from like a thought experiment, through intuition, through an example, which if you don't understand that example, you have nothing to link that codified, rational, whatever you want to call it, sentence explaining it without the actual example or the problem that these people are trying to solve, or what they witnessed in the experiment, right? Like I think it's really hard to connect the dots without it.
No, absolutely. I think we also now live in a world where the theory is based on someone being practical, but then you can't learn it without learning the theory. Now we say you have to learn the theory, even though their theory was based on someone already doing it. It's just it hadn't been codified into this type of knowledge yet, which is kind of ironic that like universities will teach all this stuff, but their findings are based on people actually just practicing this stuff. It's interesting. So, implications of quantification. Techniques in various fields have been developed to translate key variables into numerical terms. This includes representing a country's wealth via gross national product, public opinion through polls, and personal values via psychological surveys. In neoclassical economics, for example, consumer preferences are assumed and quantified, effectively sidelining taste as a variable. Entrepreneurial activities and innovations, being hard to measure and predict, are often excluded. This focus on quantifiable risks leads to the neglect of inherently unpredictable areas, such as ecological challenges and shifts in consumer preferences. And that's another, like, that reflects our approach in today's society as well. This idea of taking this like qualitative experience and trying to quantify it, turn it into some number that we can put on some standardized metric, because then it suddenly has value. Yeah.
And also there is also like hinting at, we tend to also measure sometimes what's easiest to measure, and when something's hard to measure, we just kind of ignore it almost to some degree. Or it's like it's not put on a high of a pedestal when you can't measure it. I mean, like, for example, stuff like human happiness can't really be measured, so we try and use proxy measurements such as there's even people that claim like correlation between happiness and like GDP and shit. It's just like, okay, well, I don't think it's linked, to be honest. But
I think we're also guided by these metrics in the sense that it requires more cognitive effort to figure something out that can't be measured on some standardized measure, on some standardized metric, right? And so we naturally like go towards the easier route. It's easier to like follow these kind of, go down a path that can be measured, rather than like, oh, actually, I should probably focus on this, right? Like a prime example would be like, oh, I can measure all the things like the self-tapes that I do and the auditions I do and things like that. But actually, the main thing that makes a difference is like my acting ability. Like, do I think that I'm improving at it? But there's no measure for that, right? But it's more difficult to do. You can try and create
measures, couldn't you? You can try and create
metrics.
You
could, but once again, this is the whole thing. Is like, but then once again,
they're going to be subjective to some degree. Like, it's really interesting because there could be a part. So I feel like some people also in that context might feel that they think their acting's got better if they're just more confident, for example, and they might conflate confidence within the moment to actually being better, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because it's so hard it's so abstract as well. It's so hard to measure something like that. Like, what is better in that sense?
And that's exactly it. And that's why it's more difficult, because you have to figure that out. A lot of this is like, especially if it's rooted in your purpose or your vision, then it's purely subjective, and you have to figure out what you think is good or not, right? But that requires effort. It's hard work. And so a lot of the time we just are like, oh, well, no, I did a self-tape today, so I'm that's good. I tick, But it's like, was the self-tape good? Do you know what I mean? And I feel like because we have so many of these standardized metrics in society, or it's easy to measure certain things, that we end up just going down the route where we can measure something rather than the route that actually brings us the most benefit.
Yeah. Cool. So, on to practical knowledge. So, a lot of scientific insights are probably quite accurate, but are hardly practical. The hallmark of most practical local knowledge is it is as economical and as accurate as it needs to be, no more and no less, for addressing the problem at hand. It's quite a good success. It's quite a good way of measuring if something's practical or useful. It's like, oh, it worked. Does it matter? Like, I find it quite funny when some people like might criticize you. Could be your parents, could be whatever, for your way of doing things. They're like, oh, why'd you do it that way? It's like, well, did I or did I not achieve the same thing you wanted me to achieve? But there's something we have about like, oh no, there's a correct way to do things. When the reality is, no, there isn't. There's just ways to achieve results, and there's many ways to achieve the same result. And I still find it funny because obviously everybody has their own personal
social
preferences
norms
of how to do things, and it's so funny when you watch people go like, wait, what? You're doing it this way? It's like, well, did I like you're criticizing me, yet I've just achieved the thing you originally wanted me to do. So what's wrong? But yeah, I like this definition of what is successful to be like a practical idea. Is it just works, even if it's as long as it addresses the problem, it's practical. So, understanding Mētis. Mētis is evident in the historical local measures of area, weight, and volume, where the goal was to serve a specific local purpose, like measuring a farm's size by the number of cows it supports, rather than fitting a universal measurement unit. This type of vernacular measurement often provided more locally relevant information than abstract units. Its inherent variability made it unsuitable for standardized state use. Indigenous communities' classification of plants is another example. They categorize flora based on practical uses such as medicinal properties or construction materials. This contrasts with scientific classifications which are often based on less visible theoretical criteria. And we definitely stopped on this before, didn't we? We were talking about how it's so funny how when we're in biology and stuff, especially like plants, we categorize them based on their biological names, which are just ridiculously long and unmemorable. And just for me, at least, I just don't care.
Yeah.
But like we talked about before, but if you can categorize a plant on basically what it can do for us, you instantly remember it. Like I remember dot leaves because I know for a fact if I get a stinging nettle, they're meant to like improve it, right?
Yeah.
That's the only fucking thing I remember. Like it's just crazy how things in my head at least should be always categorized based upon some form of use or something that at least means something to humans. But obviously, abstract biological names mean fuck all. Genuinely.
Yeah. They really do.
Even like stinging nettle to some degree, it's in the name. It stings you. I remember it because I know what it does.
Yeah.
I'm not going to remember some rogue plant name that I have no idea what it does.
Yeah.
Or its properties. And it's just mental how we've like almost gone to this like scientific way of thinking where it's like we're going to define it via like the biological way or these guys like to define it. It's like, well, but it means nothing to nobody apart from them to be sat on like a thing to like, justify their payroll. Like, oh yeah, we know this name or this plant and this species. Like, cool, well, who cares?
And that's the thing, is like it can be labeled in so many different ways or measured in so many different ways. So which objective one do you pick? Or if you have to make an objective one, which one do you pick? Why would you pick one that's like very Latin? And I think like there's probably a historical element here where just because you did it in the past, it's now stuck. They used to do this. I mean, like think about like Darwin, like, reporting certain animals and like, they all have like Latin names at the end of the day. But I mean, it's not really applicable now, right?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. It's just for me, it's just the fact that it's not really like fine. It's cool, like it, but it's like it's not really a practical way of. I'd rather describe things through their behavior or use than I would from just like a really random Latin name. You're just not going to remember it. I think if you kind of build like a personality into the names and it kind of describes what it does, how it looks, you're way more likely to remember it.
Yeah. But I guess the issue here is that so there's first contextual experience, right? The Mētis. Oh, fucking hell, God, just a second. There's first like the Mētis, right? The contextual experience, and then you have to translate that into theory. Now, your context is exactly that. It is local. It is applicable to you. If you then try and translate it into something that is a lot more objective, then you lose a lot of the meaning, right? Especially if that theory is then picked up by someone who's in a completely different field from you. So you can understand how someone who is a herbologist, who goes around naming these plants, who has all this experience, right? This Mētis, and then they put it into a theory, and then that theory gets applied to loads of other people who aren't herbologists, and yet the framework of measurement, the way of understanding them has stuck. So now it's irrelevant to us, right? The person who's not the herbologist, why would they understand the Latin name, or like why would that have any value to them? And yet for some reason that has stuck as like the objective measure.
It's almost to some degree the illusion of like just this more scientific because it's more complicated to some degree. It's almost like you overcomplicate things just to, justify some people's expertise almost, I mean, I was I'm pretty sure the last time we did this, I was referencing the fact that it's funny how in video games, you make potions or you consume plants, let's say it's an RPG, but you consume them because it's got a 20% health gain.
Yeah.
But if it was called some bloody Latin name, I'm not going to touch that shit. It doesn't mean anything to me. Do you get what I mean? Like, random, like, there's no benefit explained. Why would somebody care? To some degree. Maybe that's a very cynical way of looking at it. But I personally believe for the average person, they care more about the effects and what it can do.
Yeah.
Rather than what it actually, like, the scientific definition of the name is.
Yeah. So
yeah. Anyway, that was my.
That was your rant, but it was relevant rant. So
So effectiveness of practical knowledge. So practical knowledge is highly effective due to its focus on detailed observation of the environment, especially evident among traditional cultivators for two main reasons. So the first, these cultivators are directly invested in the outcomes of their observations, relying solely on their own knowledge for decision making. Unlike modern farmers, they don't have the luxury of consulting external experts. And number two, economic constraints or marginal living conditions often drive these cultivators to be more observant and innovative. For instance, a fisherman dependent on a less abundant river will be more motivated to develop a new fishing techniques and closely monitor fish behaviors than one with a plentiful supply. And that kind of does make sense, this idea. I like this idea of like environmental pressures to spur innovation. And there is a massive thing to be said for being stuck in the mud and like having to solve a problem allows for more innovation. Like if things are plain sailing, like here, like you've got like a plentiful supply of fish, you don't need to innovate your techniques because you're fine. But when you're struggling, you then have a problem to solve, and that's when innovations happen. Because you don't innovate when there's no problem, right? Everything works fine. Okay, we continue as it is, which is really interesting if you think about it. Like there has to be some sort of level of adversity / problem for change and innovation to even take place. You can even argue that on the sort of like behavioral level to some degree. If you don't have any challenge in your life and you don't have a reason to change, why would you change? Whereas when there's a problem you have to face or an adversity or something that happens in your life that changes you, you then have to adapt and innovate yourself. You're on a beat, mate.
I thought I unmuted myself. Yeah, and that only comes from experience. Literally, like you can't get that any other way because you are faced with reality, and reality throws unknowns at you, and you have to adapt. If you were to just stick with your one like method of fishing, and then it all dries up, well then you're fucked, right?
Yeah. Well, I like the idea as well. Obviously, obviously the second point was sort of the constraints allowing you to innovate, but I also quite like the idea as well of you own the problem as well. Like you have a reason to do these things because it's something that you are responsible for the outcome, right? So like you're then motivated to want to do it. Valuing practical solutions. So the widespread adoption of variolation across continents exemplifies the eagerness of traditional societies to embrace methods that address critical issues. This pattern repeats with inventions like sewing machines, matches, flashlights, kerosene, plastic bowls, and antibiotics. These innovations, by solving crucial problems or reducing drudgery, were quickly integrated into daily life. The success of these products underscores the importance of practical effectiveness in Mētis knowledge. Essentially, people are drawn to knowledge and innovations that offer tangible solutions to real-world challenges. So this is once again why I think back to these ideas of the plants again. Like people need to know how to use the knowledge to solve problems. Be motivated to have the knowledge. Do you get what I mean? Like if the knowledge has no practical purpose, a lot of people just switch off, me included. Like a lot of the reasons I feel like we also kind of read books to some degree is because we see the title, we see what the book's about, and then we go, oh wow, I would love to know this knowledge so I can apply it to my life. That's kind of how we see it to some degree. I'm sure people listening is part of the reason why you listen is you want to have the practical knowledge of what this book offers to change something or use it for real world problems. That's the only way you can self-motivate yourself to want to know something, in my head.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are very utilitarian at the end of the day, and that only makes sense, right? Like, and in that previous example of just like fishing, fishing for survival, it's a very basic problem, right? But we're problem-solving creatures, and so we need to know things based on
goal-orientated creatures, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like realistically, old traditional knowledge of plants would not be some theoretical understanding of it. It would be like, oh, this is for this is for that. This is medicinal. This gets rid of this. It's all purpose oriented, and you would be taught that. And that traditional knowledge is Mētis knowledge that is literally just verbally passed down from like your elders or your family. But we've become so detached from that. This theory has become so objective and kind of devoid of any actual like context or like function that it's very hard. It's like rote. It's like when you're at school and you're just told to learn something for the sake of it. It just doesn't stick whatsoever.
It has no practicality, or it doesn't give you motivation because you didn't see it as a use case. You know?
Well, it's information at the end of the day, and your brain is just saying this isn't important.
Yeah, no, exactly that. And the only way you can either think about is why it's important is what problem does this information actually solve? What does this actually help you to do, kind of thing. Like, why? Otherwise, why should I care? Kind of, that is the question I guess we will ask to some degree. So the very last point on practical knowledge, the factors contributing to the disregard for practical knowledge. 3 main reasons contribute to the undervaluing of practical knowledge. The first is there's a professional competition. Practical knowledge often challenges the authority and relevance of specialists and their institutions. Secondly, the ethos of high modernism tends to dismiss historical and traditional knowledge, with scientists often considering themselves superior and discounting the value of age-old wisdom. 3 is, and last, the incompatibility of practical knowledge with scientific methodology is a significant factor. Scientific standards demand evidence from controlled experiments, and knowledge derived outside of this framework is often dismissed. This scientific hubris acknowledges only information obtained through empirical methods. But the reality is, I'm pretty sure most scientific breakthroughs have been done through incremental, problem-based solutions through practical means. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like people sit here and just, without these sort of experiments, doing this like practical tinkering.
Yeah. Most inventions are not created by scientists.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah,
like think about it.
People trying to solve real-world problems, sort of thing, right? Yeah, it's just people on the ground trying to solve what's in front of them. Scientists
are the ones that try to figure out how that person made it, right? Like how it works.
Explain how it works. Yeah,
exactly. So it's the practical knowledge that really gives you the bang for your buck at the end of the day. All right. So last part. How to make development planning better. So improve your planning development. Stephen Marglin highlights a crucial challenge in planning. The future's unpredictability makes rigid planning ineffective. Based on this insight, here are strategies to enhance development planning. Number 1, embrace incremental steps. Acknowledge our inability to foresee all intervention outcomes. Adopt a cautious approach, taking small steps, observing the results, and then planning the next action. And this is what we were talking about earlier, wasn't it? It's like, you want that feedback mechanism. It's inevitable that we will jump into a system and we'll probably fuck it up to some extent. But let's not, jump full in and then like completely fuck it up. Instead, do it incrementally and be aware of any kind of feedback, of any like negative output that occurs. Number 2, prioritize reversibility. Choose actions that can be reversed if needed. Irreversible actions carry permanent consequences, particularly in ecosystem interventions. As Aldo Leopold advised, it's wise to maintain all components during modifications. And I think that's really a really good point as well. You want to be able to reverse it. You don't want to, completely screw up the food chain by introducing a new animal and then it's like irreversible, right? You want to be able to go back and be like, okay, let's think about this again. Let's go back to the drawing board. Number 3, expect the unexpected. Opt for plans that can adapt to unforeseen changes. In agriculture, this could mean preparing land for various crops. In housing, building in flexibility for changing family dynamics. In manufacturing, choosing versatile locations and equipment. And I think a lot of that is also the kind of anti-fragile approach, right? The kind of black swan idea. The idea that you can't foresee everything. So if something was to occur, how can we kind of make this system a bit more impenetrable? How can we make it grow from stresses or like from issues that arise? And then number 4, count on human ingenuity. Assume that future participants will bring or develop insights to refine the project and design with the potential contribution in mind. Which is quite like I think Jordan Peterson kind of touches on that a lot with like the like not global warming, but like, the environmental crisis, because he says that, look how far we've come in 100 years. Our population has, doubled, if not more. And yet look at how many problems we've been able to solve, how much poverty we've been able to eradicate. You have to be able to have faith that humans will come up with solutions. It's what we do. We are problem-solving creatures. And I think having faith that like, as long as you haven't irreversibly fucked something, then, that you can figure out, you can come to some like kind of new solutions. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that links back to the sort of like the fisherman thing, where it's like when people are pushed like into the point where they have to come up with a solution, they often do. Because, people need to be motivated, or enough people need to be motivated to find a solution.
Yeah.
And the more people you have thinking about it, the better, I think. And I think we can count on human ingenuity to some degree.
Absolutely.
I think often the problem is we're solving the wrong problems, and we haven't defined it correctly. and we need to think of the problem in a different way and therefore solve it differently.
Yes, and I think also, a lot of us aren't in the position to solve a problem in the
No.
sense that we're learning all the theory, but we're not actually experiencing the problem. If you look at have you seen some of those amazing inventions that some people in Africa make to obtain water or to create electricity? I mean, it's they do it in some backyard made of scrap metal and all this stuff because they're presented with that problem. They have to figure out something to get by. And most of us, I feel like in the Western world, we're not. We're pretending like we're being presented with these problems, but actually it's just information overload, and we're just talking about theory and someone else talks about that theory, and it's just this ever-ending cycle, but actually we're not in reality a lot of the time. Yeah.
Cool. So that is Seeing Like a State. Second time lucky. Nice and recorded. All done.
Let's hope the track's all processed this time.
Yeah.
God, I'll be
just trying to think, do you want to do a little mini review? I mean, the book itself is pretty. I feel like if you got to this point, you've heard some of the points being made again and again and again.
Yeah.
Trying to think, what was your biggest takeaway from this then? If you could think of one thing that you thought was the most important from this book.
I think it's about determining what goal you're going to pursue, if you're going to interfere with a system, what value are you placing? What value are you pursuing? Because that choice will naturally have an impact on all the other kind of values, and you'll never know all of them. But that's why you need to approach it like it was just saying, incrementally. And I think that's quite something. Before you act, make sure you're not deluding yourself into this is the only way to do this, or this is the only thing that I can get out of this. Yeah. What about yourself?
I think the obviously the idea that one of the state's main objectives is obviously legibility. I thought was really interesting. I think it makes society and our current lives make a lot more sense to some degree. Knowing the history of where last names came from, knowing the problems the government's trying to solve with legibility, and then also I mean that's more of an overall it's not really practical knowledge, right? But I would say the thing that I'm thinking about a lot, and I didn't really pick this up from the first time I recorded this, but this idea of pragmatism, I really think is really important. Now looking at things and being wait, we're describing that in such a unpragmatic, weird way when there could be something so more interesting about what this knowledge is saying, rather than with the plants, for example. I can't get out of my head now. Why are we still defining these things through theoretical means which mean nothing to nobody? I mean, obviously, apart from the few people who can decipher the biological names and know what it know it. Why have we set that up as a system instead of just explaining things through what their use might be? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just my upbringing where that's maybe there are people out there who have this. They study plants from their actual use.
But that's the point, isn't it? It's why is this being made the objective measure that most people use? I think that's the thing. It's there definitely will be people who talk about dinosaurs use their Latin names and stuff like that. And there probably is a purpose to that. In fact, when you actually look at Latin etymology, a lot of the time, the sub-words within the name actually make sense, right? Okay. It's leaf that, stings, something like that, but in Latin. Do you know what I mean? But my point being is for most of us, that doesn't make sense because none of us speak Latin. Yeah. So why is that still this kind of objective measure?
Yeah. I could even say stuff I was trying to think of the application for animals, because obviously most animals they don't have a specific use case for humans. But then I was thinking, and to some degree we do this, but actually characterizing the names or explaining the animal through its behaviors and its characterizations more than just its name. I don't know. I feel this, but maybe that's just an element of poor teaching potentially. I don't know. But there's this idea of making things practical, and I think it's so interesting how we've lost the practicality in life to some degree. I think it touched a little bit on what Rory Sutherland sort of says with his views on transportation and things. We now over optimize for metrics we want this train to be 10 minutes faster, but that doesn't really matter for most people. What actually matters is their experience on the tube, for example. Could you make it more comfortable? Could you allow them to do work? Like, is this type of thing. Like, he made like a joke, something along the lines of like, why would you reduce the speed of the Eurostar for like spend 10 billion on reducing the speed of the Eurostar by like 10 minutes when what you could do is just get models in Champagne for 10 billion on every single Eurostar.
For 1% of that budget.
For 1% of the budget. And it's just like, it's like this different solutions to these problems. And when we like objectify everything into quantifiable metrics, we forget there's actually more like psychological solutions to things as well. And that's completely separate to this book, but it just reminds me of that, because it's we focus so much on the stuff that's measurable rather than things that's immeasurable, such as perceptions, subjective, all that sort of stuff. And we kind of like we've lost that. A bit like with the aesthetics and stuff. We can't measure the subjective appreciation of a building, but we can measure the square footage and the economics of it. So we just do that. And you're losing like the magic of reality to some degree from that.
Yeah, it's sad because like we end up becoming too like goal oriented, and we neglect the experience, right? Or the actual because or the quality, right? Because those two things can't be standardized, they can't be measured, right? And that's the thing, is like it's kind of sad that like a lot of the time we can focus on one measure and be like, oh, I really need if I can do this, but actually we're not even aware of just the quality of the experience, like what it's like being on the train. Instead we're like, oh, I need to get there at this time, I need to get there really early. So there you have it. Seeing like a state.
Seeing like a state. So next I think we potentially should be doing Anti-Fragile, possibly. Not 100% sure on that. If not, there is a bunch of other books I can send your way. I'm going to come with you in a couple of days with the tyranny of metrics. That could be one we get into. Obviously, we just spent the last 2 hours ranting about metrics, so we might as well continue that theme. Possibly that one or Anti-Fragile, and we'll catch everybody in the next episode.
Sounds good.
That's a wrap.
That is indeed. Hey guys, well there you have it. We hope you enjoyed that book summary. Now we know it can be a lot to take in all at once, so if you want to be able to read this in a more palatable size, or you want to be able to implement any of those key actionable ideas that we were talking about in this episode, head on over to our website at wisewords.blog, where the book summary will be waiting for you. Also, don't forget to check out our socials, as we consistently upload the key ideas, benefits, and actionable ideas from all the books that we read. The links to those will be in the description below. Now, we want to be able to get you the best content in a way that's really easy to understand, but we need your help. Your opinion matters. So you are our feedback mechanism. And with those quick actions, whether that's leaving us a like or a dislike, commenting in the comment section below, or subscribing to our channel, all of those help us gauge what we're doing well and how to improve on our method of delivery. So if you have any thoughts on the matter, don't hesitate to act. It takes less than 10 seconds and it really helps us out. But with all that being said, until next time, stay wise.